So, with that, why don't we jump into today's topic? So, I am here with Sean Roberson of Savage Riffs fame. Sean, for folks that don't know you, why don't you talk a little bit about how you got your start as a designer and what you do for Peg Inc. with Savage Riffs?
Yeah, I got my start as a designer while I was attending the University of Texas in Dallas. I was in the arts and technology program in a game design and production bachelor's degree. I was in the Air Force previously in military intelligence, and so used my GI Bill to go back to school and study the things I wanted to study. And while I was doing that, I met a bunch of the different Savage Worlds peeps. Actually, one of my classmates. His father is one of the core designers on East Texas University, and I'm from Houston. I was going to school up in Dallas, but we went back to Rice University for a convention, and I met all those guys. I met Shane, and they were like, "You got to come to ChupacabraCon," and went out there and met a bunch of more people, and some people were really generous and discussed a lot of things about the industry with me. And I say, "Hey, can you write us a one sheet?" And so I wrote a one sheet, and then next thing I knew, they were talking to me about, hey, can you work on this? At the time, it was the Coalition book. It ended up being Empires of Humanity, and it covered most of the human factions in North America in the Rifts for Savage World setting. And after that happened, that went well. I also helped out with a lot of the art, and I was sort of the guy on the team that had been, a super nerd for Palladium. And so eventually I ended up, Shane asked me to work on a document so that we could have a conversion document to bring Savage Rifts into the Adventure Edition, into Suede. And that's when we realized I got to, I think, 70 pages, 60 pages of a Word document. Now, these were just one line. I need to change this. We need to change this. We need to update this word. But the thing is that, people who play Savage Rifts know that it touches the sci-fi companion, the fantasy companion, the superheroes companion. It touches the horror companion, all these different concepts, and it builds in all the zaniness and crazy possibilities of Rifts. And so that's when we realized we need a new second edition. And Shane made I think, the right call, the great call to go ahead and he paid me, right? And we developed a second edition of Rifts for Savage Worlds. We went through an extensive playtest feedback period, which we finally got the chance that people have been playing the game for years, and we got the chance to really take a hard look at what their experiences were, where they thought things could be improved a little bit or updated a bit, and it was really great to be a part of that discussion with the fans, as a fan as well of both Savage Worlds and Rifts. And so since then, I have been, I guess you'd say, promoted to the line manager and line editor. And so we've got a lot of things that are in planning now, and a lot of things that are finishing up. Atlantis is finishing up production, as I'm sure you hear like every week in our Pinnacle meeting.
Yeah. For folks that don't know, every Monday we have a peg-wide meeting, and everybody talks about the stuff that they're working on and what they worked on last week. It's kind of like a stand-up if you're familiar with Scrum, and so we get to hear every week the various things that Sean's working on. And these books are not fast to make, so it's a lot of, okay, we got through this chunk of the book. Now we're working on this chunk of the book, and now this chunk of the book.
Yeah, it's interesting. You get these 192-page books. I mean, that's almost 200 pages, and like with Atlantis, we've got as much equipment in there as we have in the original Savage Rifts Player's Guide. There's just so much stuff. There's all these new, arcane systems for tattoo magic now, and stone masters and stone magic, and there's just all types of crazy stuff, that rune weapons and bio-wizardry equipment. It's really nuts stuff, but it's been a lot of fun to work on, and we're closing in on that end of the production with a lot of the art and internal feedback and stuff. So
yeah, so you heard it. You folks have, I think, at this point, heard how I got involved with Peg, how Sean's got involved with Peg. If you just look at the two of us and don't look at anybody else, college is the way to go, apparently. Because we both got involved with Savage Worlds through college, through somebody that knew somebody that was working on it and then started working on it. So, don't actually use that as don't go to college to work on Savage Worlds. But I do think it's funny that both of us had that very similar experience.
Yeah, it is. That is very interesting. And I think there was a lot of value. At least the college that I went to had a really good program, some really great professors. One of my professors had worked on Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. He'd been in with all that and knew, all the big movers and shakers, Gary Gygax and all those guys, Dave Arneson. And then he moved on into video games and worked on all types of cool games, including the Red Faction series for THQ, and then later on, he last thing I think he worked on professionally was Elder Scrolls, the MMO, but it was great to have him as my professor, right? I mean, I was just sitting at his feet, like, please bless me with more knowledge.
Well, Havenheart, you've gone 3 times. Do you qualify? I don't know. What'd you get a degree in? That's the question, right? I think Sean and I are at least in the tabletop industry, rare instances of people that actually have game specific degrees that work in tabletop. I think most folks don't. And when I worked in video games, a lot of folks did not have degrees in games to work in video games.
Right.
So
if
you don't have a game degree, yeah. Outlook looks good.
Well, I would say that the main thing is just, you can read about all the high level game design concepts from a lot of those great developers. You don't have to go get a degree in it, but having that inquisitiveness. Okay, when someone says, what's ludonarrative dissonance or ludonarrative, right, harmony, or different things like that. I mean, these are terms that are important, and they're terms that people that may not have had a degree in the subject, but if they're in the industry, they're going to start to know those things, right? And you have to be able to have conversations with them about things like that at some point, I think, when you get to the high levels. But just having that curiosity and going to conventions and meeting people and trying to write some of your own stuff, having the audacity to say, hey, do you want me to write a one-sheet adventure for your game? Let me submit this to Pinnacle, and but treat it professionally, right? Especially that
is that the sound,
the writer's guide,
Shane and Simon exploding as you say, just submit one sheets to Pinnacle. That not necessarily, talk to people first. Don't absolutely send in one sheets.
Right. That's not what I mean. But if you go to a convention and you meet them and then talk to them about it, right? That's what happened with me, right? I talked to some of the guys and they said, hey, why don't you try a one sheet? Let's see how it goes. And that can be a good opportunity, but don't do it. Don't cold call. I would say be careful about cold calling.
I do want to know, how much money did Chris Landauer pay you to bring up ludonarrative in this stream?
Is that a thing? Did I just?
I brought it up, I think, the first and second streams, and now I get heckled every time I do a design corner by the rest of the Pathfinder team on if I brought up ludonarrative dissonance or harmony in the stream yet.
Well, then I have played into your evil schemes, I guess.
Well, so everybody at PEG, it's not just me. So make fun of Sean too.
Sure, make fun of the guys that research the basics of the concepts. That's okay. I'll be an outcast.
We'll be outcasts together. We started our own tribe over here, but so you got involved with Savage Rifts, and you're, kind of where you really started doing a lot of work, and became eventually the point man for it, was in that conversion into basically the second edition. Even though I don't think we use that language so robustly.
Yeah, I mean, we use it. I use it because we have. I mean, I usually refer it to as the Suede edition, right? But sometimes on the boards or chatting with people, I'll say first edition or second edition, just to make sure that they know what I mean, because the books, because of the different amount of revisions, the books can be pretty different. If I say, hey, go check out the Game Master's Guide, well, maybe the section I'm referring to isn't there. And that's why we added it or updated it, right?
But so that you got the experience there of not only kind of having, the let's look at other things that were in the original version of Rifts that we could continue to bring in as we continue to revise the system, but also the process of, okay, we did our first pass, and this thing worked, but this thing could be better, and maybe we need to rethink this thing. What was that experience like, and what were some of the hurdles that you had to kind of jump through? Maybe not necessarily jump through, but the challenges you had to overcome in updating the design to Suede, and then also making those improvements where you could.
Yeah, that was really tricky, right? Because Suede was actually very in flux at first, or actually until it was done, until the day, because Suede had its own playtest period. And so at a certain point, the other writers that I was working with, we kind of said, hey, let's put down the Suede updates for a little bit. Let's focus on, expanding the adventure material and plot point campaigns and things like that, and really honing that stuff in. And then we'll come back, because we've done a lot of the basic Suede move over stuff, but you have to kind of wait until that process has settled and the dust has settled. But there were a lot of really cool things that happened. The addition of power modifiers was really great, and that was a possibility where we could take in Savage Rifts, we had mega powers, right? And so when we were looking at, let's update it to Suede, Sean Bircher went and he took all the mega powers and turned them into pretty simple power modifiers. And I think he did a good job of it. And then Shane came to me later on in the process and said, hey, these are really cool, and it's really cool to have these mega power modifiers, is what we'd done. Probably a terrible thing. But just Rifts, you just add mega damage or mega armor or mega powers. But what Shane wanted me to go back through and do is look at the basic steps in the math for when you're doing a bolt or a blast, and here you spend this many points and it's increasing the damage this much, or the range, or whatever. And so that actually ended up being a big rework, where a lot, like most of the stuff, was rewritten or changed, and really went back and forth with like Shane, and he really went through it. Simon really went through it. I think Clint may have looked at some of it at some point. And so there was kind of an all hands on deck. We don't, with Savage Rifts, we don't have quite the team that you do. It's basically me most of the time, and then I talk to Simon or Shane or Clint or something as necessary. And so, especially with at that time. And then the other thing was, dialing in some of the themes of the setting. Some of the players said, hey, we feel like there should be more of an emphasis on maybe horror, or the characters are powerful, but they're like really powerful. And so one of the things that I decided for the core update to the Adventure Edition, that we were going to dial back the power level a little bit, but to make sure that people could still play those power levels they want to, sort of like the Superheroes Companion. I added a campaign power level options table into the Game Master's Guide. And so things like that really helped make it so that players could play the kind of game they want, and it's their game. But at the same time, as someone who's trying to manage the brand and manage the feel and dial it into as close as I can get, step by step, towards being true to the original material and the original feel of the game, of Palladium's riffs that we've licensed their world and their setting. That it was kind of a way to have your cake and eat it too. But and then there was a lot of little things like you talked about, with you're going in and you're just dialing in and tweaking the wording about, okay, a leyline walker is, can be wanted in Federation of Magic territory or in Coalition territory, but we want to make it clear that might be for completely different reasons. The Coalition hates Magic users. In the Federation of Magic, or the true Federation of Magic, it might be because their authoritarian leader, Lord Dunson, if you don't swear allegiance to him, and you are an iconic hero, right? I mean, you're not like some little wizard that learned some cantrips or something. You're a leyline walker. He's going to demand that you swear allegiance or deference or something to him. And so just dialing in a lot of those things. And then the other thing that could be tough is sometimes, making sure that each archetype or iconic framework has its own lane, its own special, cool, nifty stuff, which I know that y'all worked really hard on that with Pathfinder. Now, but Rifts, we're coming from a lore that doesn't really have what is that called? Where you can the hybrid characters in Dungeons and Dragons. Multiclassing. Thanks. I just couldn't think of the term. But yeah, Rifts doesn't technically have a ton of multiclassing like you might get in Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder that people will want to see. And so we were able to dial along those lines a little bit, but it's interesting. It's interesting because the original Palladium Rifts has classes, and in Savage Rifts we have iconic frameworks. And the frameworks you start out with the good stuff for that class or that character concept, but then you kind of have the freedom of choice to take whatever edges or skills or advancements that you want with your character, right? And I know that y'all have something kind of similar going with Pathfinder, which by the way, beautiful book. I read through it and I really loved what y'all did.
It's largely the beauty is the work of Carl Kiesler and Simon doing a bunch of the layout wizardry. But yeah, that's a very important point that you talked about with the iconics, right? Because you've got multiple avenues, right? You've got here's the narrative that is presented, right? And we've got to fulfill that narrative on one level. If the Glitter Boy does not do the things that when I read a story or a narrative insert or whatever about a Glitter Boy, if they can't do the same things, then I'm let down as a player, right? Same thing in Pathfinder. I expect the Paladin to be able to do Paladin things. I expect the Rogue to be able to do Rogue things. And then I think the place where in both systems, because we're in Savage Worlds, have so much more freedom is we need to do less niche protection, right? There's, if you're designing a new class for like base Pathfinder, well, very much you need to protect that niche of what does a rogue do.
Right.
But in our game, right, like the best example is, so you want to be a fighter. Okay. Take fighting. Done. Right? It's that simple for basically everybody. You want to stab somebody with a sword? Take fighting. Increase your fighting. You're basically good to go. And, there's a lot of dials you have to tweak and to benefit that for your character. But we don't have that, okay, well, we need to make sure that the person who is always objectively the best at stabbing somebody with a sword is the fighter, right? Because we know that by the time you're done playing a Savage Pathfinder character or a Rifts character, they are not going to be, in a lot of cases, right? There's some people that really do want to drill down and they play the one thing.
Right.
But they're not going to be so strictly that thing you originally started, being a city rat or a glitter boy or a rogue or a paladin. By the end, you're going to be something a lot more bespoke to the decisions you made as a player. And that ties into a question that Dersham 80 had, which was, so having not tried Savage Rifts, can a city rat work in a party with a glitter boy and be useful?
Well, I mean, sometimes that's open to opinion. But no, absolutely. Actually, we had a very interesting question that came up during the development of the Adventure Edition of Rifts. Was that and it was during the campaign, the Kickstarter was going, and I remember someone came in and asked, well, what happens how are you guys, because Rifts has these iconic ideas, right? The mega damage or city rats and glitter boys, and they said, what happens if a combat cyborg punches a city rat, right? So very similar. And one of the things that we came up with, because again, there's this from the Palladium lore, mega damage, just to explain to anyone that doesn't understand it, is that it's basically 1 point of mega damage, which is for like vehicles and giant, jets and fighters and stuff like that, or powerful robots or power armor or demons or dragons. 1 point of mega damage equals 100 points of basically hit points. So a lot of times if you flick somebody with some mega damage, it's going to splatter them. Well, Savage Worlds handles damage in a completely different format and style, right? It's a wound-based system as opposed to a hit points-based system. There's a lot of differences. And one of the ways that when I was working on the update, is that I introduced a special rule for, it was a situational gritty damage. So if you had someone that dealt mega damage and they were attacking someone who didn't have mega damage protection, then they would damage is dealt normally, but they would also roll for an injury as per gritty damage in Savage Worlds. And we felt like in playtesting that really was a lot of fun. People had a lot of fun with it. They felt like it's funny. Sometimes you read something on paper and it might sound one way. And you might say, "Oh, that's a terrible idea. I don't want to do that." But then when you play it, you're like, "Oh wait, that was really fun. That really was thematic." And so we got a lot of feedback that people were like, "Hey, when we actually tried this out, it was really fun." And it doesn't usually harm NPCs, right, or extras, especially because if they take a wound, they're out, right? But when it comes to heroic or enemy wild cards or important NPC wild cards, it could be a lot of fun. But yeah, and to answer that question too, is that in Savage Risk, one of the things we've done is that if you're playing one of the iconic heroes, like the iconic frameworks, like a Glitter Boy, a Dragon Hatchling, a Combat Cyborg, if you go and play the more skill-based or ability-based ones, like the Rogue Scholar, the City Rat, the Wilderness Scout, we call them Mars. It stands for Mercenaries, Adventurers, Rogues, and Scholars. And so the Mars characters, they start the game at seasoned instead of at novice. So they get those advances to get them up to seasoned, and they get some extra rolls on a special chart called Fortune and Glory. So they have, and we expanded it in the Adventure Edition, so they have even more different special circumstances that can happen, where they might have a cool vehicle or a sidekick, or maybe the guy's gotten a little bit of cybernetics or has some special skill that they get to put in there. And so we thought that was a lot of fun. And in the playtesting, we've had a lot of really positive feedback with that they can stand toe to toe. Now you don't want to try and fight a Glitter Boy in a fight toe to toe, right? But you guys can definitely adventure together, fight the same monsters, save the same people, right? It's definitely balanced to a way that it fits the theme that and the lore that it's coming from, and it fits the Savage World system and that kind of modularity.
That was something that I was going to say. It sounded like you really leveraged into that. We can chase balance in basically everything that we design ad nauseum.
Right.
Right.
Oh, that's a whole other thing. Yeah.
Balance stops when the book or the game is done and we don't have any more time to work on it, and so we have to put it down. and it sounds like you kind of went, well, we could spend a lot of time and energy trying to balance this, or why do I want to play somebody that is one of these Mars characters? Well, because of these cool things that I'm not necessarily going to have with this other character. Let's just give them that. Let's make that the focus, right? The balance is you had fun when you play that character at the table, not at novice they have, the same chance of killing one another, because it's those variances in those characters that makes people want to play them. And if they're having fun, like you said, right? Once people start playing it and they have fun with it, that's all that matters.
Yeah, I mean, balance. I mean, so one of the great things about Savage Worlds, and the reason it's kind of like peanut butter and jelly with things that come out of, say, the Palladium game system and Palladium books and their stuff, which they also have a sort of a universal system. You can use basically the same rules between their different games. But the thing with Savage Worlds is that there are build points to build your own race. There are build points to do this and that. The idea is right there when you're taking hindrances and getting extra points to buy skills or edges or attributes, right? And so the original Savage Rifts team did a really bang up job and took those ideas and applied them to Rifts. And so that even though nothing can be perfectly balanced, there are hindrances and complications and things like that are put in there to help balance out the crazy power of a Cyber Knight or a Glitter Boy. And in the same way, and in a mechanistic way that is easy to apply in the rules. So for instance, the Glitter Boy straight up says, because of how big and shiny it is, you get this penalty to your stealth checks. It's just all the time, right? When you fire that boom gun, it causes a sonic boom, and anybody nearby in a large blast template has to check or lose their hearing, right? And these are ways that you kind of they've added rules to things that maybe weren't as defined in the Palladium system, and I think that that's a lot of fun. because then you've got that idea of, sure, when we're writing new books, you try and balance it. And it's really interesting because I'll see that some really great, smart fans will go through and add up the points values for everything. Some of the guys will use the superpowers companion, right, to try and give everything an explicit points cost or whatever. And that's not exactly how I approach it, although I do use points. But it's interesting to see how different people will perceive the value of different abilities. And some abilities are really more just for flavor. They sound cool, but how often are they really going to come with a campaign, right? So when I was developing the True Atlantean race, they know how to use magic stone pyramids, and they can recognize vampires on sight. But really, how many points are those abilities worth? How often maybe in the right campaign, if you were just fighting vampires and constantly moving from magical pyramid to magical pyramid, it would come up a lot. But most of the time in most campaigns, I don't think it's going to come up all the time. Therefore, it's not given a ton of points, and some of them aren't given any. It's a flavor thing to put in there that you just want to make sure that the players are aware, hey, this is a cool thing for your heritage, right?
Yeah. And you brought up something that I think people often do not value enough when it comes to creating balance in Savage Worlds, right? Like talking about, the Glitter Boy is not going to be able to sneak around, especially once they start fighting. And this is something that Shane just mentioned in chat, how we balance holistically, not just in combat.
Right.
The situations that you are in and that you will encounter are as much part of the balance as anything else. Right?
Right.
The fact that the Glitter Boy is not the guy that you want to send in when you need to sneak into a place and, steal something maybe, or assassinate somebody, or spy on somebody, you're going to want one of those Mars characters because that's the stuff that they can do. That's, it kind of gets into that conversation we had a little bit earlier about niche protection. Sometimes it's not necessarily you design it with niche protection in mind, but you realize that this character cannot fill these niches and these other characters can. And that is often enough to make them an interesting, valuable character to play. You don't need
Right.
to worry about in combat, are these abilities worth the same points values? And like you said, it's interesting to see where people put value in those builds, right? Like we've had that with people figuring out the points for the ancestries and for the classes and saying, oh, is this edge, this prestige edge actually balanced out to a single edge and things like that. And sometimes, we look at how somebody's pointing out like, oh, well, this ability actually works in this way, don't you think? And so isn't that more valuable? We're like, oh yeah, you're right. Right. That's kind of the thing that is amazing about being able to have this stuff go to the audience. And, like this is my first time ever working, in video games. We never got the process of we could release something to our audience and have them do a bunch of testing, help us make the game better, and then actually release it.
Oh,
And
it's
so
super
this
valuable.
process
Yeah.
is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it is, this niche protection is interesting. One of my favorite things to do is one of my really good friends in my personal game when we're playtesting a lot of stuff. He played a Glitter Boy, and I was like, of course he played a Glitter Boy, right? But yes, or you could end up with ludonarrative dissonance. Exactly. But yeah, he played this Glitter Boy character, but when in one of the plot point campaign in the Empires of Humanity book, you end up heading to Washington D.C. and crawling through catacombs and all this stuff. These old bunker and tunnel systems, and so boy, that wasn't easy for his Glitter Boy to do, right? Suddenly, there was a lot of value to characters that could be useful in a situation or some sort of like commando stealth op. And there were times when the Glitter Boy had to make the decision throughout the campaign. Hey, am I going to just like kind of provide overwatch from a half mile away on top of some hill ready to blast stuff, or am I going to move in and go in with my buddies? We need to go confront this crime boss. I can't just waltz in my Glitter Boy. Am I going to go in just wearing my pilot suit, right? And so those are fun. Those are fun things to do too. I mean, you don't want to steal their concept and never let them get to use it. Again, right? That would be a heinous sin. But at the same time, you want to show them, hey, sometimes your character needs to be able to do things outside of that suit, or else you're going to have a short shelf life.
Yeah, well, and that's something that point specifically, I think, is a point that cannot be under stress because You go on forums and Reddit and social media, and all the number one thing that I always see new GMs ask, in any system, right? In Savage Worlds, in D&D, in Pathfinder, in any of the Genesis system by Fantasy Flight, any game is, my player can do this. How do I stop them from doing that? And it's like, you probably shouldn't. They have that thing is on their character sheet for a reason, because it allows them to be cool. It allows them to have some fun. Don't solve your players, just solve their solutions, right? Present a problem, and then as they're figuring out that problem, figure out, okay, well, what happens because they figured out that problem? Solve their solutions. I can't take credit for that specific quote. That's from Matt Koval over at MCDM. He says,
he's great. Is not Matt Koval's great.
Not to solve your problems, it's to solve your solutions, which is a great way to look at it.
Well, and sometimes, that's what gaming is, right? It's giving, maybe in a scenario, giving everybody something to chew on, right? Throw something that the glitter boy needs to chew on. Throw something in there that the crazy and the juicer need to chew on. Throw in something that someone else needs to deal with, right? The mind melter or the ley line walker or the techno wizard, right? If you can throw in things that are going to be a kind of wrench for each one of them, and they need to tackle that first in an encounter, or it gives some sort of vulnerability to them in that encounter, that could be really interesting. Boy, it's great to see a glitter boy duking it out with an Ultimax, or 2 coalition spider skullwalkers, or whatever, because that's what they're there to do. And the point isn't, go have the spider skullwalker just mow down the rogue scientist or something, right?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the enemies should be picking their targets appropriately too, right? If they waltz onto the combat field, they're going to think, hey, the enemies are going to see the paladin sitting there, or the fighter with all his combat abilities, and they're going to try and probably take him out first, and he's probably going to be out in front. But then that lets the rogue or the ranger do their thing too in the situation. So that keeps it interesting.
And then you could also, when the party has all gone into this melee press and the spellcasters are shooting their stuff at the back, you ambush them from the back, and then all of a sudden the drama, which was at a 5 or a 6, ratchets up to 11, because holy crap, somebody's stabbing the wizard right now. We should probably deal with that.
Right. Well, I remember one time we were playing, and there was some Slew War slavers that showed up, and their ranged attacks were pretty ineffective on the glitter boy because of his armor. But boy, one of those Flugor slavers actually got a hold of him with his tentacles and started trying to pull his suit open, and boy, then the glitter boy needed the crazy and the juicer and the other characters to come in and save his bacon. So interesting things happen too when people get ace really high, or get a really good roll here on grappling or something. A lot of fun things can happen with Savage Worlds, and that's one of my favorite parts about the system. Right. Is how dynamic it is.
So one of the things that you mentioned earlier when you were talking about the mega power modifiers was the fact that at one point, after you kind of had this draft,
right,
you had to kind of go back in and basically break it down to brass tacks. And this is something that as designers we do all the time, of and it depends on the type of designer you are. Some folks, they always start with a system. Other folks go with, what do we want it to do? And your systems designers are the ones that would have gone in and say, okay, well, let's look at how many like on the Savage Pathfinder team, Mike Barbeau is definitely the most systems designer of all of us, right? When we're designing an encounter, he looks at, okay, well, what should be the average parry and toughness? And okay, so your enemies going to be doing this amount of average damage, so we should have them at this strength with this type of damage. And that's one way to approach it. And then the other side is to approach it with well, what do we want it to do? Okay, it does this thing. And you kind of think of it as a series of problems to solve, as opposed to let's build the building blocks. But very often, right, when one of the downsides of that type of design, which is a lot more, you can do a lot of things much faster, but you do run into that problem occasionally of, okay, now we got to kind of step back and make sure that it works systemically, right? Everybody can do the things we want, but now we have to make sure it works systemically. So what was that process kind of specifically like?
It's been really interesting. There's a lot of things that can be very interesting there. And I don't think that, and if you're as a really savvy designer, maybe you just realize that you need to have different hats, right? And you say, okay, well, let's look at it from this angle or that angle, or you could say it like lenses, like some of the I forget what the book was called, but yeah, one of the game design books that we used at UT Dallas was all about lenses.
Or having other people on the team. That's what that's great for.
Or having other people on the team, knowing when you need to call in somebody else for a second opinion. That's also important. But, with Savage Rifts, there was definitely that idea of, okay, we need to try and balance this in a way that it can ramp up. And it was fun, though, because now we could easily say, okay, well, I'm going to modify this basic power with this power modifier that is now going to be it's going to be harken back to this, well-known Palladium book's ability in Rifts, right? And so that was a lot of fun. We had the ability to add support or nods to, different thematic things in a very simple way without just adding a bunch of powers, which, as you know, can be very difficult. And at the time, I really didn't want to mess with that because, we really wanted it to be very, very, very we wanted Suede to be the foundation, because Savage Rifts was going to be the first game to have Suede support. At the same time, one of the things that I think Shane would agree with, and that we've talked about a bit, is that the Savage Rifts has a different damage paradigm than like Pathfinder, right? You're not going to pull out plasma cannons and particle beam weaponry and rail guns, and you're not going to be fighting, the same type of chthonic enemies and stuff like that in Pathfinder that you might be in Rifts. Probably not any the size of like, a building.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that in the end, it seems like you can do 1-to-1, and we did build off of the same building blocks, but I would not suggest necessarily just taking all of the really high-end Savage Rifts power edges and stuff like that and throwing them straight into your Pathfinder game, because we have some where it's called blaster edges. And if you're a spellcaster and you get these blaster edges, or I should say have an arcane background like psionics or spellcasting, but if you take these edges, then that just increases the damage dice when you're casting a bolt or a blast or something like that, and that's not going to work in Savage Pathfinder. So
right. Well, and that's kind of one of the things that also I think, like one of the people, one of the things that a lot of people were talking about is, way more than I expected them to, was the notion of taking their Savage Pathfinder characters and dropping them into Rifts games. And, that one of the things that I think folks should keep in mind, like you mentioned, is you've got to remember the style of game, right?
Right.
Pathfinder at its core, right, is a very much a focused in skirmish level game, right? That's why in original Pathfinder, progress was often measured in how many rooms did we clear in the dungeon. Whereas you come over to a game like Rifts, and the scale is just larger, right? So you can definitely do things to bring those characters up, but it's the same paradigm as you're talking about with the Mars characters versus, characters like the Glitter Boy. You just have to understand at what scale are you talking about with these different elements.
Well, right. And I was talking to Kevin Simbita the other day, right? And we were chatting about some of this stuff. Rifts is really superpowers or superheroes in disguise, right? It's the Glitter Boy isn't a Glitter Boy. It's like War Machine, right? In the Marvel comics. You wouldn't take a Pathfinder character and dump them into a cosmic level supers campaign. And expect them to be able to hold their own. And so I took a similar approach. I really want people to be able to say, I want to take my, my character from Deadlands or my character from whatever and bring it into Rifts. And there's nothing more Rifts than people pulling stuff in from other IPs and dimensions and, any zany concept they have that they could build. And so we actually have a sidebar on that in the Adventure Edition of Savage Rifts, where you're able to grab some of the cool stuff from your setting, right? And then you build the character up to seasoned level, kind of like you would if you were making a Mars character. And then you bring them over, and still they might have a hard time where they're running around and they need to, they're fighting some monsters and they're totally outclassed. And they got to head back to town or find some allies and get a suit of, mega damage body armor, pull out a laser pistol. Then they might be able to hang with or a vibro weapon, right? A vibro sword. That paladin might need a vibro sword and a suit of mega damage plate armor, and then he can hang with Rifts characters, right?
but that's kind of, you describe that process, and that's like, isn't that exactly what you want, right? I'm not bringing in Pathfinder Paladin into Rift because I'm so in love with the Pathfinder Paladin that I want to play it in every game I play. I'm bringing that Pathfinder Paladin in because I want to see what the Paladin looks like when he's got the super tech, the Vibro sword, and he's got the powered armor, and he's being thrown into combat by one of the other characters because he's much smaller in scale than compared to them. That's the stuff that you want to see. So
yeah, and I see Shane makes a comment here too. If you want to put that up, he says it's easy to do. The GM just needs to make sure the adventure is appropriate for their power level, and I can't stress that enough, especially with Savage Rifts. And we've tried to say it in the Game Master's Handbook and stuff. Is the Game Masters, we try and dial it in the best we can, but the Game Masters are going to have to at some point adjust some adventure encounters for their group. If their group is a wilderness scout and a city rat, and you don't have any of these big combat hosses, well, you might need to plan appropriately, or let them plan appropriately, right? Give them a chance to, by hook or crook, maybe instead, to defeat that target. Or another thing that I introduced with the campaign power levels is there's a campaign power level where you just build a regular Savage Worlds hero. You roll once on the hero's journey charts, which gives you about an edge worth of something cool. And then you go out into the wild wasteland and see if you can survive. And that's definitely not for the faint of heart. But I think that if you have the right GM, you have the players have the right mindset, you could have a lot of fun with that too.
Yeah, it's one of the things that no matter what we ever do, and like you mentioned earlier, right? That coming over to Savage Worlds, that mindset. Actually, I think maybe we were talking about this before the stream, of running into so much more often it's up to the GM to figure it out, and we often decide very specifically we are not going to give a rule for this thing, or we're not going to give you advice on this thing, because if we do, now you're just thinking in terms of what we told you as opposed to the GM coming up with it.
And it's the comprehensive modifiers thing, right? So I think it's on page 33 or 31 in the Adventure Edition, right? Is we have the sidebar, and Shane pointed out to me, I'd almost missed it, right? I'd seen it, but I hadn't really thought about it a lot. And he said, in this edition, we're not doing comprehensive modifiers. Well, that's for everything, right? That's the philosophy, is that the players can figure it out too. Not the game master can figure it out, and the players can figure it out. One of the my perverse pleasures has been to run at conventions back in the before times. I would run these adventures where the heroes were playing as, in the Rifts lore, there was this thing called the Apocalypse, right? And the Great Cataclysm, and so it was in the near future in like 2098. So 15 minutes in the future, where they've got some new laser guns and flying cars, and the apocalypse happens, and so I had the players playing as just what's called NEMA. It's like kind of like a counterterrorism and disaster response soldiers, and they weren't glitter boy, so they weren't combat cyborgs, they weren't all this stuff. They were just regular Joes, and they needed to deal with Rifts level stuff, Rifts level monsters. And I remember one guy who shall remain nameless, really great guy. I remember they got to this point and they were fighting a monster at the end of the scenario, and he realized the biggest gun they had, one of the characters had a plasma cannon, right, that he could carry around. He had this plasma gun, and he realized if he unless he got super just a regular damage roll, he wasn't going to hurt the big monster. And he got mad. He threw down a pencil. He stood up. He almost walked away. And I just smiled at him, and he sat back down, and we kept playing. And they had to realize they needed to use the support rules, the test rules, right? And they threw a grenade in the monster's mouth so that it didn't have the armor value against it. All these different things they did to get all these advantages, make the target vulnerable. Then they were able to defeat the monster. And so some of it is the players just had to figure out that they needed to use teamwork against this really big enemy. And that's just a testament to player ingenuity, game masters, the use of bennies to reroll damage and reroll the hits, and then using your brains and to figure out a problem, figure out what the weakness of that monster might be.
I think every designer, either independently, just through experiencing it, or by other designers telling them about it, always comes to in tabletop specifically, comes to really understand that where the rubber meets the road and where you have your best sessions is when it's Wrath of Khan and Captain Kirk says, I changed the conditions of the test, right? I cheated. We don't mean literally start, ignoring your dice, but when your players start to figure out what tools do we actually have. In a game like Dungeons and Dragons, it's often there's this magic item on my character sheet that I never really thought about, but now that we are going to die, I've come up with a really clever way to use that. In Savage Worlds, it's often, situational stuff, right? Let's use this ally, let's use this facet of the environment, but also that, system mastery of let's use the tools that we've always had in front of us. We just kind of didn't really engage with them, and we're just doing the kind of, the rinse repeat of attack damage over and over again.
Right.
Those are the moments that I think we're basically all just trying to design so that we have continuously. Because if our players are doing that every session that we go into, we're having the best sessions that we possibly can. And so much of that does come from us getting out of the way of the GM and letting the GM put their players in that hot water.
Absolutely. And that's another place where also your skill-based characters can really succeed and excel, is when you have things like, hey, we just had this big battle, but the ship that we're traveling on is now on fire and sinking, and people are trying to get in lifeboats, and hey, it's dramatic task time, right? And now suddenly those skill-based characters are going to be much more important to that story. And if you have these maybe combat type characters that don't have non-combat skills or abilities, well, they're going to think, maybe I should take some skills in repair or electronics next time so that I'm useful in other ways too, right? And it's fun when you see the characters start to build what would seem to be a non-optimal just for pure combat setup, but they become much more well-rounded characters and much more interesting characters that are able to adventure and make things happen in these crazy savage adventures that they might go on.
Yeah, I am somewhat notorious in groups that I when I do get a chance to be a player, not a GM, I am notorious in the groups that I play in for being the guy that accidentally makes us not go many sessions without combat, because I will just talk my way through every problem that we encounter, right? Oh, these guys want to fight us? Well, I can talk at them long enough and with enough ability to persuade them in charisma that by the end of it, we're not actually going to fight these guys. And, that's also something that you don't think about when you have all those tools in front of you that are just like, well, it'd be 2 rolls and this guy'd be dead. But all of a sudden, when you don't have those tools or do things like you're talking about with the other game where they've got to deal with, Godzilla, and there are a couple of, that's the plot of every one of the kaiju movies is we got these little guys running around. How are they going to deal with Godzilla, right?
Right. Yeah.
John Doom also brought up a great point, which is, kind of another iteration of the stuff that we're talking about is, let the players come up with novel solutions, and as GMs truly avoid saying no when they come up with clever stuff you didn't think of. That is,
absolutely.
The other thing that we sometimes, in a conversation talking about, okay, let's describe how this thing works or how this skill works. I think this just came up with Pathfinder of we were talking about different ways that we could mention using like your faith and your spell casting for knowledge skills, and how we didn't necessarily want to say in those skills, oh, you can also use it for this knowledge, because then it becomes very much, okay, that's the tool I'm going to use all the time.
Right.
But ultimately, I think we added a bit to, it was either cult or common knowledge, I forget which, but that basically put that caveat in there, because we were talking about it, and I forget who brought it up, but somebody said that, well, if we don't anywhere in here give that allowance to the player of saying, hey, GM, consider letting them use these other skills, a lot of GMs will read the rules strictly, and then because they're just trying to survive, right? It's stressful enough being on that side of the screen. So they'll be like, well, the rules don't say you can do this, so I'm just going to say no because I don't have the time or the energy or the mastery of the system to make a design call like that on the fly.
Mm-hmm,
I think that's something that this definitely skews my experience running games, but as a designer, whenever I run into something that the rules don't necessarily either elegantly handle or it takes a little too much digging for me to find, I'm always comfortable with just making a rules call and moving on. And that's something that I think a lot of GMs, especially ones that are newer and haven't had that experience, do struggle with more. And that's one of the areas where we as designers can kind of help them out in the rules as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've seen and I've tried to do is a lot of times, I forget, I don't remember which system it was, but it was, hey, roll 50-50, flip a coin, whatever, right? And to just make a decision on how to move forward and keep the game rolling. That might have been Palladium advice. It might have been something Kevin wrote, but it's the idea though is you just need to keep going but make a note, right? Later on, go look up, do that deep dive that you might need to, because hey, guess what? That's probably going to come up again in your campaign. And so you'll need to make a decision, or maybe you need to make, so you need to decide. You need to make a decision. I could say house rules or a setting rule or something like that can also be a way to deal with things like that if it's important for your game. So yeah, I think that's definitely something to keep in mind. And then as designers, right, we want to give that affordance to the players that we're building that logical framework for them, both through the rules that we're writing and in the adventure material that we put out there, right? Where in the adventure material, you're kind of teaching them how to play the game too, because it's a published adventure, right? So you're saying, okay, well, in this case, maybe these are some of the skills they would want to use. And so if you're focusing on, hey, you're trying to identify this, it's an orc, and you're trying to figure, they're trying to tell the Rifts heroes are trying to tell if it's an orc or not, right? Well, you could use common knowledge because that's a pretty common monster. A cult should be like a little bit of overkill, right? But those are different things that you might want to use, and then that helps the players and the game master all kind of get a feel for it as they game along the path, the adventure path, right? Or the plot point campaign.
So I think we've covered a lot of ground. We kind of hit the high levels of what it was like, working on translating, kind of that second edition. Basically, which one would it have been? It would have been Deluxe Explorers Edition. I always screw up the names. I was going to say Explorers Edition Deluxe, but I knew that was wrong.
Yeah.
Translating that into Suede, and also the other, elements from Palladium Rifts that you could bring in that either needed a second pass or just things that in the original version couldn't be brought in. We also talked specifically about how that the kind of design process looked like specifically within the vein of powers. Is there anything else that you think that we should talk about real quick before we end here that we haven't already covered? And also, again, I posted it in the chat, but reminder for folks, throw your questions in chat and we will certainly get to them.
Well, and it's the same kind of idea, right? So if Savage Rift stuff is high level, Savage Rift characters are supposed to be able to run around and fight tanks, essentially, or science fiction aircraft or whatever. Hey, guess what? Yeah, at some point, your powers, if you've got all the blaster edges up to heroic or whatever, now you can fire a bolt. You can spend a lot of power points, but it's the equivalent of a heavy laser, right, out of the science fiction companion. Or with the upcoming Atlantis book, if you've got a Sword of Atlantis, one of the most rare, powerful weapons in the game, this rune weapon, when you wield it, you're going to be hitting like a Mack truck, similar to a rail gun or a plasma weapon or a laser weapon, right, against a vehicle. And that's part of just making sure that whether the characters, you don't want to just say, oh, well, only guns can do damage like that, right? Well, no, hey, in this system, this is part of the gamut that we need to cover. So heroes need to be able to do that with melee weapons or with powers or spells. And then other times, though, they just need to be able to get around it through, a glitter boy doesn't last very long against a mind melter who's puppeting him, or there's a lot of different ways around that, but that's an important thing. And then I think that when it comes to the iconic edges or the class edges, like you'll have in Pathfinder, that's another opportunity to give expansion and growth room for a character type that is customized for them, right? It's not generally available, and so that can be a lot of fun and very powerful as well.
So Dersham80 asks, any Pathfinder updates I can drop on you folks? Like we were talking about before the stream, a lot of the work we did yesterday when we had a design meeting on it is a lot of like not sexy bookkeeping stuff of like, okay, let's make sure that this crafting cost is here, and a lot of little bits of like, okay, we've got the system for how much this cost, like potions, for example. I don't think anywhere we specifically called out that potions, like the rest of the crafting system, it's half cost to craft. A lot of like just like things like that of like people got confused because we've been in the system for time has very little meaning, at least over 9 months now.
It's like
I
a
was bad with
baby.
time before.
You've birthed a child.
Quarantine has only made it worse.
Oh, quarantine, yeah, that messes with your sense of everything.
But a lot of the work's been like that. We're going to have some new, I think, some class balancing stuff that we're going to be dropping in. I don't know. There's nothing like that I can just be like, it's this thing. Everything is very finicky at this point. Which and Shane has said this about the Pathfinder development before. One of the things that we're very lucky in that is we are not running into major issues now, right? We've been dealing for basically like the last 4 to 5 months of development on what realistically are very narrow issues that aren't, okay, we need to redesign this entire system, right?
Right.
We've never, it's been a very easy going process, and I, knock on wood when I say that. But it's not one of those, we've been trying to rack our brains to figure out how to get this book out because we just still don't have a good design for X. Everything's going pretty well. And based on what I've been hearing, that sounds to also be the case for Atlantis, the stuff you're working on.
Oh, yeah, it's weird. One of those weird things. So Atlantis took me, I mean, I did it myself basically. And that was probably a mistake, but it's also a good experience. It took a little longer because of it, but in the end, before it hit anyone else, I'd had time to go over and over and over, and work through a lot of things, and make sure that it was my design. And that was a lot of fun. And one of the things that Kevin Simbita said, he said, hey, enjoy the development. It doesn't always have to be apples to apples when you're converting things from Palladium riffs to Savage riffs. He said, have fun with it. And so I really tried to keep that in mind and do that. And I think that can be fun. That can be good to do especially once you've gotten the basics down, with a conversion or a system. But, no, when I look at the Pathfinder stuff, it's interesting because it's interesting to finally have this conversation because we both did kind of the same thing, right? We're working on taking an established IP and bringing it over to a really very mechanically different system. And when I say that the Pathfinder book is beautiful, it is a beautiful book, right? It's got a bunch of great art and layout and all that kind of stuff. But I also mean from a system design standpoint, I think it's a thing of beauty. So I just, again, I like a lot of the decisions y'all made. I think that in a lot of ways it's extremely Savage Worlds, right? While being Pathfinder for sure. And I love it. I love the combo. And I love the way that it's built. And I'm looking forward to playing it. I also like how your team went in and you're getting it. It's not like you just threw this big conversion over and you're throwing a book out there, right? You guys have been playtesting the combat mechanics. And hey, does a large shield really need a +3 to parry, or should it be a +2? Right? It has all these other bonuses. All these little things are being re-examined and looked at and refined. The gang up bonuses was under discussion for a while. I think those are really healthy things. I think that's really great. So what the fans are getting is actually a very fine-tuned, very play-tested, right, product. And now they're getting to put in their word too. And I can't say enough about the fans for Savage Riffs. They are diehard. And it's funny, whether they're old school Riffs fans, a lot of them are. Some of them have never heard of Riffs or Savage Worlds before. Other ones are just really old school Savage Worlds fans. And we just get we have the greatest players. I really feel like that. And it was such an honor to be able to work with them updating riffs to the Adventure Edition, and to be able to listen to them and rely on them and just put my thoughts out there, and they would reply, and usually very respectfully and very, very positively with different ideas. And that's what was really great, is when the fans come to you and say, hey, what about, I think this is a problem, but this is a solution I see. And sometimes with Savage Worlds, you want what the most elegant solution is, right? So sometimes they're going to come up with something that you could have never thought of, because it was so simple you couldn't even see it, right? And that's where it gets really genius. I mean, I had that same experience when we were updating the juicers to the Adventure Edition. Shane was like, how about we just have that burn die, have it just be a D6, but they can get it on all these other rolls. And it was just like, oh, that's a very simple solution to something that I'd been trying to do. If they roll a 1 on the burn die, they lose a burn. And I tried to put together some entire vigor check system that just, it was kill your babies sometimes, right? And you have to move forward. And but sometimes, again, the most elegant solutions are the simplest ones, and that's really the test of time for a great game. Whether it's Pathfinder or Rifts, that's what makes it Savage Worlds, is to be elegant like that.
Yeah, and the passion at which, having come from an environment where I worked on a lot of games that were successful but did not have passionate fan bases, the passion of the fans really, it's an invigorating thing. And I think we're really lucky the fact that we get to work on a system that has such a passionate fan base. And even when people get a little testy, you're like, oh, we think you're ruining the game because you've done this thing. Well, the only reason they commented that is because they care about it so much.
It's from a place of love, exactly, and that's what you have to realize as a designer too.
So we got a little bit of love in the chat from Veritool. Looking forward to the Tattoo Magic characters. I will make sure to pass your love on to the rest of the Savage Pathfinder team. I am late for the playtest. We timed this stream very poorly. It worked better back when we were in the old time zone. One last thing before we say goodbye. Next week's Design Corner, the topic is going to be identifying bad design. So we definitely, and we've had plenty of experiences with our own design, seeing other people's design, of what is a red flag that indicates that probably needs some more work on, right? This is not go and use these tools to go and bash people's design, but rather, how do you identify in your own design and things that you're working on, things that are likely going to cause you headaches and need revision and need work on. So that'll be the topic for next week. I'm sure you've got thoughts on that as well, Sean. I hope we can get you on a Design Corner in the future, hopefully around when Atlantis is coming out. It's been a delight to have you.
It's been really great to be on. I appreciate it. Anytime you want me on, I'm here. I'd be happy to be on. It's been a really great discussion. And again, congratulations on all the great work with Pathfinder for you and the team.
All right. Well, see you folks later.
Cheers.